Well, hello, welcome to the channel, or welcome back if this is not your first time watching this channel. I appreciate you stopping by. So I want to start this video by doing a bit of housekeeping. So firstly, I wanted to say I'm absolutely shocked by the amount of views my last chess video got. I got almost 1,500 views in my first chess video, and I was not expecting anybody to watch that, so that was absolutely incredible to see. So what was so cool about having so many people watch the video, I was actually able to get some constructive criticism and some feedback on that video, so I was able to hopefully change all those things and correct all of them for this video. I ended up getting a new microphone, I ended up changing the settings and stuff like that, so hopefully the audio quality is going to be better now. It doesn't sound as though I'm living in a can, like one person said. I actually just enjoy comments in general. Even if it's criticism, I think it's really funny and I get a kick out of it. So feel free to express yourselves in the comment section in whatever way you deem necessary. So because I was actually able to get some feedback, I want to start this video by doing a bit of housekeeping. So I'm actually going to start by addressing an error that I made in my last video when I was teaching you the King's Indian defense. So when I was teaching you all the King's Indian defense, I was showing you the basic moves. So the King's Indian defense arrives after the move d4, and then you play this move knight f6. And so the variation that I was showing you in the video was this immediate e4 that your opponent plays right here. However, honestly, that was not the best thing. A couple people pointed out in the comment section that nobody really plays e4 in this position immediately because it kind of just blunders a pawn. While there is a scenario where people play this, it's called the Omega Gambit. This is a line. However, this line is generally considered better for black, and while your opponent does have an argument, and the argument essentially is you're going to take this pawn over here that they just put out on e4 with your knight on f6, and then so what they're going to try to do is then bring their bishop out to d3, developing a piece with the tempo. However, that argument isn't super good because then you have this move d5 right here. You are now opening up a square for your light square bishop to be developed, and then you're also defending your knight simultaneously. So honestly, this is not a really good opening, and you're going to rarely see this, even at a lower level. So what you're going to see more commonly is you're going to see this move d4, and then you're going to go for your King's Indian defense, knight f6, and then what you see before they push e4 is they're going to play this move, knight c3, so then the e4 push is then supported. And so then the idea that I was conveying is correct where, okay, so now it's being supported, you're going to go for your normal King's Indian defense, so you're going to go for your g6, try and fianchetto. However, then your opponent pushes e4, and then that move d6 that I was talking about is super important, because I was correct in saying you do want to meet that push of e5 with that pawn on d6, and then obviously you go for that exchange that I was talking about in that video. So that's it for housekeeping, and now I'm going to get on to the point of this video, and the point of this video is I'm going to be teaching you how to be a better tactician at chess, and in particular I'm going to show you how to play more brilliant moves, and I'm going to teach you some important traps and ideas that you need to know to help you improve in chess. Now granted, I'm not the best tactician at chess. Obviously, I'm only about 1800, although right now I'm around 1700 because I've had a really bad week of chess. I lost over 100 elo this week. So I'm going to teach you some basic principles and ideas that kind of indicate whether or not you have a potential brilliant move that you can make, whether or not you're going to have tactics so you can utilize and allocate your time better, so you're not wasting a bunch of time when you just have normal development moves that you need to play, versus when you're in a really critical position where you could play a really intelligent move that then wins you the game or gives you a big advantage. So I'm going to begin this lesson on tactics and how to get more brilliant moves with this game I played a few days ago. So one thing that I want you to keep in mind when you're trying to determine whether or not you have a brilliant move, some type of sacrifice, or some really good tactic that's going to allow you to either checkmate your opponent or get a huge advantage, is I want you to keep in mind the positioning of your opponent's king. Anytime your opponent's king is in the center, when there are heavy pieces on the board, or when your opponent's king is in a really weak space, the probability that tactics are going to be available is much higher. So when your opponent's king is weak, you want to be looking for these tactics and sacrifices much more closely, spend more time looking for them, because it'll often be a really good use of your time in the games. So for this instance right here, we have all the heavy pieces on the board, and my opponent's king is on d3. Yikes, that is not a square where you want your king to be, ever. Because when all the heavy pieces are on the board, you want your king to be hidden in the corner, because you have to think, your king is the most beta piece in the game. The king is a beta. Anytime he's under attack, he either needs to run away or he needs protection. Especially when the queen's going after him, the queen whoops him 10 out of 10 times. The king has absolutely nothing to do. So when all the heavy pieces are on the board, your king needs to be in the corner, cowering, like the little beta boy that he is. So what I'm thinking right now is, oh my god, my opponent's beta boy king is out on d3, and I've got my queen isolating all of his escape squares. So when you want to think about whether or not your opponent's king is super weak, you want to think, what is the positioning of your king? Do you have any pieces that you can utilize to attack that king, and how much mobility does he have? If the king's mobility is limited, that typically means that your opponent's king is in danger. So what I do in this position is I try to aim as many heavy pieces towards my opponent's king as possible. So I have a very inactive, very passive rook on a8, so I try to make it a more active piece, so I put it on that semi-open file on c8. So the logic behind this is I'm going to have a very active rook once I move this knight over on c6, and also once I move that knight on c6, not only is my rook active, it helps my piece that's already active, which is my queen, it helps give her backup for potential attacks on the king down the road. So my opponent, not understanding the logic behind the move that I just played, they just play some very bizarre move that is just absolutely greedy. They try and take my pawn over on b7. However, this loses the game on the spot because they are not looking at tactics. They are not looking at what's changing in the position. So now that I have this active rook, they now just put their rook on a less advantageous square for them. What you want to do in a position like this is you want to assess what just changed in the position because of the move my opponent just made, and what can change the position after I move a piece. So right now I'm thinking, okay, I have a lot of pieces, a lot of ammunition aimed at my opponent's king, so I then want to start attacking the king. And now I have two pieces in mind that can attack the king very quickly and immediately. You want to make your attacks fast, you want to make them expedient, and you want to make sure that they go straight for the king. So in this position I have the two pieces. I have the queen, which I can utilize to attack the king, and then I also have the knight, which I can utilize to attack the king. And so when you're trying to determine which piece you want to use for your attack, which piece you want to use to check the king, you want to think which piece is placed better where it currently is. And so for this specific incident right here, my queen actually is already beautifully placed because it's already cutting off all of the escape squares from my opponent's king. That beta king is stuck in the center and she is not letting him out. So I do not want to move her because she is already placed in a very advantageous position for me. However, my knight is not really attacking anything right now. My knight is not a super advantageous square, and my knight's also kind of blocking the development and the activity of my rook. So the knight is the piece that I want to move. But where can I move my knight? And if I do move my knight, what changes the position? This is what I start thinking about, and so I start doing some calculations. So for this incident right here, this is just a simple mate in 2, as the computer is saying right now. This was very easy to spot. So I start thinking outside of the box. When you're trying to play more brilliant moves, you want to think sacrificing material is okay if I can come up with a concrete idea that is calculated correctly that I can then use to sacrifice and then checkmate or win the material back or win additional material. You want to make sure your calculations are correct and you're not missing anything. So I think, okay, the king has nowhere he can move right now, and so if I check the king, he can't move. So then you have to address whatever piece is checking him, or you have to block. However, when you're checking with a knight, you can't block a check with a knight because obviously the knight moves over. It attacks beyond where pieces are at. So if I check with a knight, they then have to address the issue of my knight. However, that kind of then opens up a square where I can checkmate my opponent's king. So what I see is this brilliant move, knight b4. And so what happens right there is my opponent has to address the fact that my knight is checking the king because all of the king's escape squares are covered. I have the pawn covering these squares, and then as I stated earlier, the queen is covering all the escape squares in the back rank. And so as I stated earlier, the king is completely immobile, and anytime a knight is checking a king, the king has to move, or you have to capture the knight because obviously the knight attacks over pieces. There's no blocking, there's no intermediate moves. You have to address that check. Now I'm opening up that file for my rook, and that rook is then supporting my queen. It doesn't really matter if my knight is captured. Actually, in fact, my opponent has to capture the knight, in which they do, because he's getting checkmated on c2, because I was able to take the king who already had limited mobility, and then I was able to smother him with the queen. So you always want to think, once you move a piece, what is changing in the position? So what happened in the position right there is once I moved the knight, and they actually end up having to capture the knight because it was a check. Checks are forcing moves, you have to address the check. It then opened up the file for my rook, and my rook was then able to team up with my queen, and I was able to checkmate the king. That's the type of idea that you want to be thinking about all the time. How can you aim your heavy pieces at your opponent's king? So this next tactic that I'm going to teach you comes from playing the Budapest Gambit, and this is going to be played against the Queen's Gambit, which is going to be really good if you watch my last video because I already showed you the Queen's Gambit, so you're going to be familiarized with this. But this also can kind of lead into the King's Indian defense, depending on what your opponent plays. If they try to not go for the Queen's Gambit, you can just play a normal King's Indian defense. If you go back and watch my last video, you'll understand how to play that opening. Obviously, since this opening can transition over into being a King's Indian defense or a Pierce defense, it's going to arrive from the first move, d4, and then you're going to play the move knight f6. This is a completely viable option where you don't have to play d5 for your opponent to still go for the Queen's Gambit. They're just obviously not gambiting the pawn. Obviously, this is a completely viable option. Just because you don't play d5 doesn't mean your opponent's still not going to go for that Queen's Gambit setup. So after knight f6, they're going to play this move c4. So instead of playing the moves I showed you before, when you were going for the Pierce defense or the King's Indian defense, we were doing this g6 stuff, your g7, and then your kingside castling. What you're going to go is for this very peculiar looking move, e5, gambiting this pawn. So the way that I ended up discovering this, I actually lost the game playing against this a few weeks ago. I wish that I had saved the game because I was trying to go back and find it, but I couldn't find that particular game in which I lost. But I kind of remember the variation that made me lose the game. So what happened was I was trying to play this Queen's Gambit setup. I saw my opponent play e5, and then I was thinking, okay, I haven't seen that move before. That's kind of weird. Isn't that just a free pawn? And I'm also winning a tempo on that knight. Am I wrong here? And so then I captured. And then my opponent played this very peculiar move, knight g4. And I saw the idea of knight g4. I'm thinking, okay, so they're saving the knight, obviously, and then attacking the pawn on e5. But isn't this knight just kind of becoming a target? And don't I just win a pawn here? I mean, I can protect this pawn very easily. Boom, I just played knight f3. I am now supporting this pawn. And then they played this really weird move, e6. And I was like, okay, aren't they just now allowing me to completely win a pawn? Because now this pawn, I don't even have to worry about holding on to it because I can just capture it. And so that's what I did. I captured, and then they recaptured with tempo. And then I thought, okay, I'm just up a pawn. I'm doing absolutely fine here. I wasn't thinking about the intention of my opponent. I was just thinking, they're playing very weird, dumb moves. And I wasn't thinking about the logic behind their moves. You always want to see the game through your opponent's eyes as well. You don't want to just be looking at the game through your lens. You want to look at it through their lens simultaneously. So what I ended up doing was playing this very lazy move because I've been playing the Catalan opening a little bit, which is very similar to the Queen's Gambit. You kind of go into a Queen's Gambit, but instead of bringing your light squared bishop out to d3 or to d2 or whatever, you end up fianchettoing your light squared bishop. So you bring pawn out here to g3 and then g2, then you kingside castle, and you hit the fianchetto bishop that's aiming down this diagonal, and you have the fine position. However, I was not thinking about why my opponent put their knight out on g4. So I played this very lazy move, pawn g3, and then what my opponent played completely shocked me. They took my pawn over here on f2. I was like, what the freak? They just sacrificed the knight. Don't I just win a knight here? And so then I captured the knight. And then they played this wild move, bishop takes pawn on g3 with check. And then I thought, oh my god, now I understand their idea here. So I capture, because obviously if I don't capture, I'm just going to lose my queen because they just checked my king and they opened up this discovery on my queen. And so I'm just going to lose my queen here. Sure, I'm going to get two pieces, but they're going to have a very active queen. I'm going to be down a queen, and they're going to be infiltrated in my position, and it's going to be a really bad game for me. I ended up losing this game. So this is a really important trap. You want to look at potential discoveries, you want to look at potential checks, and you want to look at forcing moves. And this was an absolutely wild way to lose a game. There are a few other ways that you can get into this exact same position. Like instead of fianchettoing your bishop, you can play something lazy. Like sometimes people play this move a3. I actually tried this and won a game against somebody who played a3 because their idea was to stop me from coming out here and checking their king, which is really dumb. This is not necessarily super good opening, but the Budapest Gambit at a lower level is fine. You can use it, and you probably will win a couple games with this trap, because I've won a couple. So I was able to then take that information from my opponent and then use it against other people. And I was like, dang, that was a freaking crazy trap. I wonder if it's going to work on other people around my level. And sure, it freaking has. So hopefully you guys won't lose to this trap now. So I guess one of the main ideas that you can take from this is this very important tactic in chess, which is attraction. Trying to bring your opponent's pieces where you want them to be, particularly their king. Because the king, obviously, if you get him into a square where you want him to be and you can end up attacking him, he has to address the issue. He has to either run away, he has to be protected. There's no other things. Like, he's just a beta. He just needs help all the time. So when your king is being attracted to specific squares, and you can tell your opponent's trying to attract him there, be careful. Be slightly trepidatious about what your opponent's trying to do, and be careful about your moves, because you could just be walking straight into a trap, which is what happened with me. I just walked straight into a trap and lost the game. Obviously, a really good way to improve your tactics is to play puzzles. This is going to really help you learn how to play brilliant moves. It's going to teach you little patterns. It's going to teach you things like Smothered Mates. It's going to teach you things how to set up battering rams, discoveries. These are all really important patterns to then have embedded into your brain, because then you can start implementing those and spotting those in your games. So to call back to what I was just talking about with that super important tactic, and that was a Smothered Mate, and I'm going to teach you how to set up a Smothered Mate real quick. Just set up a completely random position right here. There have been games where I've played and I've ended up getting a Smothered Mate where I sacrificed material and I ended up getting this mate. I get a brilliant move there. However, I didn't save any of those games, so you're just going to take my word for it. But I just wanted to show you, just so you get this general concept, this general tactic in your brain, and hopefully this would help you then spot this potential tactic in your own games if it happens to it. So right here, obviously you could think there's this really simple move, bishop takes over here on f2, checking the king, and then you win the exchange. However, with the way that my pieces are positioned right now, I actually have a checkmate in 3 according to the engine. And what you're going to do right here to get this checkmate in 3 is you are going to do what's called a Smothered Mate, which is where you end up sacrificing some forcing material to then shove your opponent's king in the corner where he cannot move at all, and then you end up checking him with the knight. Because as I stated earlier, anytime your king is being checked with a knight, you either have to take the knight or you have to move. And if your opponent's king doesn't have anywhere to move and they're being checked and they can't take the knight, then you just win the game. It's a Smothered Mate because the king is absolutely smothered by the knight. So what you end up doing in this position is you would play this move, queen takes over on f2, and then your opponent only has one legal move. They have to play this move, pawn h1. However, you are then going to sacrifice your queen to get a checkmate in 2. So you're going to play this brilliant move, queen g1. And you're thinking, what the freak? So what happens right now is, obviously, the queen is defended by the bishop, so they can't take with the king. So they have to take with the rook. And then what you're going to do is you're going to play this move, knight f2, and the king is now smothered. He's being checked by the knight cannot be taken, and obviously the king cannot move because he is now being blocked into the corner by the rook, and you just win the game here. So this is a really good concept to have in your brain to try and see whether or not you can set this up in the future, and if this ever arises in any of your games, you want to think back, okay, I saw a video where this ended up being set up one time, and then you want to try and employ that in your games if you can. Alright, so this is just going to be a short and sweet video. I hope you can employ this stuff in your games down the road. I hope this helps you get more brilliant moves, and I hope you learn something useful. Appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. Have a good day. Bye-bye.